So our next speaker is Jennifer Kavanagh, who is director of the Strategy, Doctrine and Resources Program in the Rand Arroyo Center, and she's a senior political scientist at the Rand Corporation. She leads Rand's Countering Truth Decay initiative, which is a set of projects that look at why and how citizens are actually coming to rely less on facts and analysis in US and political civil discourse. So over to you, Jennifer.
Great, thank you so much for having me. I also have to apologize, like Marina, for not being there in person. I would really have loved to have been able to make the trip, but I am really glad that technology allows me to be there virtually and share my presentation with you today. So just before I start, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me clearly and see me. Yes, okay, great. All right. Okay, Lauren, we can go ahead to the first slide. So truth decay, which I'm going to talk to you about today, is a concept that we've been working on at RAND since about 2016. So it predates the 2016 election. It predates a lot of what we've seen over the past couple of years. But if we go, to the next slide, I think 2021 has given us numerous examples of the ways in which this phenomena has really invaded and taken over so many aspects of our lives. Whether we're talking about COVID, whether we're talking about vaccines, or in the US, the events on January 6th, they all give us really powerful examples of the way in which truth decay is a threat to our public health, to our democratic institutions, and to our ability to tackle really important challenges globally and domestically in the US. So it's a really important challenge and initiative here at RAND that we're working on. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about our framework and some of the research that we've done in terms of thinking about this as a really holistic challenge. The way in which we approach it is that truth decay is about information, but it's not only about information. Disinformation is powerful, but it's most powerful in the political and social context in which we live, in the technology, which has already been mentioned, and the ways in which individuals and their cognitive biases create a susceptibility to the threat of disinformation that's supercharged by a lot of the trends that we see. So I'm going to use vaccines as a kind of key example. I actually have been using vaccines as an example since before the COVID vaccine, but the COVID vaccine just helps make the example, I think, a little bit more meaningful and relevant to people's lives. So if we go to the next slide. So disinformation is definitely not something that's new. If we just think about trends in vaccinations and anti-vaxxers, there have been anti-vaxxers since vaccines were invented. So you can see here on this side of the slide that there were anti-vaxxers starting way back in the 1900s holding protests against the smallpox vaccine. So anti-vax sentiment, disinformation about vaccines, about many topics isn't new. But what we've seen over the past 10, 20 years is that even as we get more and more scientific evidence, and in theory, this type of evidence should really be helping to combat this disinformation, we've seen the opposite trend. We've seen more and more people become skeptical of vaccines and other types of scientific findings. And we've also seen, at least in the anti-vax community, people become increasingly sure and certain of their anti-vax beliefs, even as we have scientific information moving in the opposite direction. So why do we see these trends? So if we go to the next slide, I think, information is a piece of it, obviously. We have an explosion of disinformation in an information environment that amplifies that. The speed of information, the volume of information available, and the way in which we access and use that information all makes the disinformation more powerful and makes easier for us to fall prey to that. But it's not only about information. It's also about cognitive biases and the way we process information. We like to be right. We seek out information that proves that we're right. And we're resistant to fact-based information that doesn't resonate in a meaningful and emotional way with us. And then it's also about the social and political context. And here we think about partisanship and polarization. And it's not just partisan political polarization that we have in the US, but polarization along many lines, whether it's demographic, economic, and sort of anything that divides us. And these divides become so deep that these issues become lightning rods. And so this context creates the demand for disinformation narratives and incentives for people to exploit information, to exploit technology, to exploit media, and the changes in the media environment to win economic and political gain. So if we go to the next slide, we really approach this concept as a system. We think about trends. What are the trends that characterize this phenomenon? What are the drivers, the things that we think are causing it? And then what are the consequences? So if we go to the next slide, we identify 4 trends that we focus on as sort of the key drivers, or the key not drivers, but the key features that we would say characterize this phenomenon. The first is an increasing disagreement about facts and data. I've already alluded to this. Even as we get more and more scientific evidence that vaccines are safe, that genetically modified foods are safe, that climate change is caused by humans, we have an increasing number of people who discard these facts. Second, the blurring of the line between fact and opinion. We've all experienced this. You can see it in online, on social media, but also in mainstream newspapers like New York Times and Washington Post. The ways in which commentary and analysis are blended in to news articles making it difficult to distinguish what's a fact and what's not. Third, the increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact and the influence that brings. Now we have so much information available to us. It's not all fact. In fact, an increasing proportion of it appears to be opinion and commentary. Even if you want to find facts, it can be hard to navigate the environment and find those facts. And then finally, declining trust in sources of information that used to be looked to for that fact-based information. And this was alluded to also on a previous presentation. The fact that people don't know where to turn to find that fact-based information means that they're left alone to navigate a really complex and changing and confusing information environment. And I think we've seen that really kind of a millionfold in COVID, that people don't know where to turn, they don't know who to trust. And so they end up trusting poor quality news sources simply because that's the information that's available or that's what they find first. So then moving on to the drivers on the next slide. We identify 4 drivers here. The first is this cognitive processing, cognitive biases, the ways in which we process information. It simply makes us more susceptible to disinformation. It makes it harder to change people's minds once they've made them up. The information environment, which we've alluded to, it's not only the changes in social media and the online world, which has been discussed a little bit, but also the changes in the actual print media. The economics and institutions of the media are such that there are incentives to produce exaggerated stories that are edgy and catch people's attention because that's the only way to get eyes on them and to make a profit, which is the underlying drive of all media companies. What we end up with is a media environment that isn't driven by facts, but instead by what sells, and that those two things are often in conflict. Third, the competing demands on the education system. The discussion thus far has focused more on the production of information side and less on what provides people the skills they need to navigate that online information environment. And that's something that we focus on a lot at RAND. Technology changes really fast, and schools change really slow, especially when we're thinking about schools like K-12 schools that have such strong local constituents. It can be really difficult to make sure that students are getting the skills they need to navigate the online environment. And that doesn't say anything about the rest of us who are out of school, but also need these skills and maybe didn't get them in school. So there's an underlying susceptibility, not only in our ability to navigate like the complicated media world, but also in areas like science and numeracy, civics. These are all areas where traditional education may not provide us all the skills that we need to navigate this world, especially an online world in which we no longer have these trusted institutions, or we feel a lack of trust in these institutions to help guide us. And then finally, polarization, which I've already talked a little bit about, the ways in which it creates a demand for disinformation and really supercharges it. It makes it profitable to spread false information. So if we move to the next slide, the consequences here, the consequences of this whole system is a world in which there's incredible uncertainty about what's true and what's not. It's difficult to make decisions. It's difficult for individuals and policymakers to get the data they need to make decisions. And we see in the political space, Jane alluded to the importance of thinking about democratic values and democratic institutions. The inability to have a basic agreement on facts paralyzes democratic institutions. It makes it difficult for policymakers to have meaningful discussions about options. Instead, they're forced to spend their time or choose to spend their time arguing over what the facts are. And so, at least in the US context, we can't make progress on the key issues: immigration, healthcare, response to COVID. These are all things where the debate degenerates to an argument about what the facts are, rather than what the policy should be and what the trade-offs of those policies are. So what I want to do with the second piece of this talk is just briefly describe sort of what this means for the anti-vax threat and why we think it's systemic. And what I mean by that is it's basically infected all of our institutions at this point. It's infected the way in which we interact with each other. It's affected the information that we consume and the way that we consume it. And so it becomes a challenge not only of countering disinformation, of identifying what the specific tools and micro level responses that improve individual education or identify false information and take it down, but actually a need to re-engineer a lot of the institutions and the relationships between individuals and institutions. So it becomes a much longer and harder policy problem to tackle. So if we move to the next slide, just thinking through specifically the drivers here and how they manifest in the anti-vax context. So first, when we think about cognitive biases, I think it's important to bring in this idea about mental models. And we know that people who express anti-vax sentiments come to that with a range of different motivations. There are some who are expressing that sentiment specifically because of partisan motivations or some kind of political drive. But even before anti-vax sentiment became such a political lightning rod in the United States, there was widespread anti-vax sentiment. And studies of these individuals suggested that they tended to process information differently than people who were not skeptical of vaccines. They had different mental models and different ways of thinking about the world. Which means that it's not just about the disinformation, but actually about the way they're thinking about it and the way in which they process and integrate scientific evidence or not into their understanding of the issue. And that has real implications for the ways in which we respond to these individuals and the way we think about strategic messaging to inform them or to change their minds over time. We've done some other survey research as part of this Truth Decay project that's allowed us to see the ways in which individuals who hold anti-vax sentiment also hold a range of other beliefs that are counter to data and evidence. So there is something about the way in which people's minds work, and understanding that and cracking that code is really important to how we tackle this challenge of mis and disinformation, and how we think about, if we want to think about changing the way media information is communicated, how can that be structured to better inform people who come at this from different perspectives? In the information environment, obviously social media plays a huge role in amplifying anti-vax sentiment, whether we think about that as kind of all the people who are spreading it, or sort of the key suspects, the ones who are spreading massive volumes of mis and disinformation. And it can be really hard to disentangle good science from bad science, especially in an environment like the one we live in now, where it's changing so frequently and there's so much uncertainty. I think there's the role of celebrities and key actors who have outsized influence in this space is really important. as is the role that foreign actors play in identifying where there are weaknesses in kind of Western democracies where we're divided. They exploit those, and that creates another layer of challenge. We've done some work at RAND looking at how media reporting is different and how it's changed over time and across platforms. And what we found is that online journalism, here I'm talking about journalism that does not have a print analog, so not like New York Times Online, but things like Politico in the US. They actually communicate information in a very different way than more traditional publications. It's much more subjective. It's much more advocacy based. It's much more emotional. And so this really does have implications for how people who consume mostly online news, which is most people, how they're getting that information. And it makes this the ability of mis and disinformation spread much more quickly and be consumed at a much higher rate. Thinking about education, education is a hugely important part of the response here. As I alluded to before, it's not just about media literacy, though. It's also about science literacy and numeracy. And we see a lot of ways in our survey research, the ways in which people are really weak in this area just naturally. And that's really apart from education level. It affects all of us, our ability to assess risk, and to make some of these judgments can be pretty poor in a lot of contexts. And so thinking about how we provide those skills and how we build cues and nudges, maybe using behavioral economics to help people make better decisions, is a really important piece, I think, of the response network. And then finally, thinking about political polarization and other types of polarization and the ways in which these spread. I think it's important to recognize the way in which anti-vax sentiments and other types of disinformation, conspiracies, they can live and foster in sort of very insular networks. And when we think about these beliefs, they're not just about the belief itself. They actually can become part of someone's identity. And I think you see that with things like QAnon and other types of conspiracies and beliefs and disinformation, that this belief becomes so ingrained in who a person is and in who their friend network is, that when you try to remove it, you're not just removing disinformation, you're also removing something about how they see themselves. And so that can be really hard. And we can't do that without providing them something to replace that belief. And so thinking about how we overcome that gap, how we change people's minds when that belief has become part of who they are, I think is a really important challenge that we have to tackle with research and think about strategies that work in that context. So moving to the next slide, the consequences of anti-vax sentiment are obviously severe. We have, before COVID, we had lots of examples of measles outbreaks and chickenpox outbreaks that didn't have to happen. And other types of vaccine preventable diseases that would cause widespread death. I don't think I need to cite those now because we see kind of the consequences of people's anti-vax sentiments about COVID. So I think that goes without saying that this example, but it's not the only one, certainly underscores the consequences of the widespread rejection of facts and data. And it's disconcerting because one hope we had when we started this project was that some kind of event like this, a crisis that underscored the value of science, the value of facts, the importance of evidence, would help to turn the tide, would help to change people's minds. And instead, it's really had the opposite effect. So it's now even more unclear sort of how we move forward and what comes next. Next slide. Okay, so that's what I want to end on, though. I don't want to end on like a sad, hopeless note. So I want to talk a little bit about responses. So what do we think then are possible responses, given that this is sort of a systemic threat that's woven through not only our institutions, but also the way we think and the way we process information, and it's baked in to so much of the way society functions at this point? What are possible solutions? So the first here is thinking about strategic messengers and effective communication. If it is the case that people's skepticism or their willingness to reject mis and disinformation is baked into how they think, then we really need bespoke responses, bespoke messages that target individual communities and even individuals to help unseat those beliefs. There's some really interesting things going on, I think, in some of the larger cities in the United States. In Washington, D.C., where I live, they have a Faith in Vaccines initiative where they're actually giving vaccines in churches. And that in some of the poorer parts of the city, those churches remain trusted institutions. And so having people come to the church and talk with their pastor or other religious official and get the vaccine there has helped to overcome some of that barriers. They're doing something similar in New York City, as well as using food banks in New York City as another site to administer vaccines. So thinking about how we can identify faster ways to develop those types of bespoke messages and how we then scale that, I think is an important line of research, and is sort of developing these community partnerships that allow us to be on the ground at the micro level. Second, thinking about new ways of presenting scientific evidence. Scientific evidence often doesn't resonate because it doesn't have an emotional tie to the individual. People respond to things that do resonate emotionally with them. So we often think about scientific presentations as being, I want to present the evidence and I have to present my data tables and things like that, but it's also about storytelling. How do you tell a story with your data? How do you make it compelling? At Rand, I always say, like, we're really good at the 300-page report, but nobody wants to read the 300-page report. So how do we do a better job of weaving that narrative? Third, I've mentioned this multiple times, but I really think, and our research has really focused on this education space, on identifying what teachers need to do a better job and a more complete job of providing these types of tools to students. But also thinking about how do we reach adult populations? What are the vehicles? Right now we have a lot of opt-in tools. So if you want to take an online course on media literacy, it's out there for you. But the people who want to opt into that aren't the people who need it. So how do we develop ways in which this is sort of, baked in again, so that people run into it unintentionally? One idea that I think would be great, but that I think would be hard to implement is, like, how about some informational videos that play at places where people are stuck, like airports and DMVs and doctors' offices? How many stupid shows have you watched on an airplane because it was on, right? So that's one way that we might be able to reach a wider audience. Fourth, and this goes back to what Jane was saying, is this use of deliberation to bridge polarized divides. I was really interested to hear some of her ideas about how we can maybe scale that, because that's really the barrier there. We know it works to help bridge divides. So how do we then scale it to wider groups, so that it happens organically? And then finally, the online space. I've emphasized here that disinformation is only a piece of this, and that I think sometimes disinformation and social media get blamed for everything, when really this is like a much wider systemic problem. But we do need to think about how we can reduce the vulnerabilities that exist online. And that doesn't have to mean managing or regulating content, but it can mean maybe providing better labels of mis and disinformation. It could mean limiting the use of bots. It could mean taking steps around advertising. So I think that we're trying to explore at RAND ways that we could think about improving the quality of online information and providing people more cues without necessarily stepping into specifically content moderation, which, at least in the US context, is so complicated and fraught by the First Amendment. So those are some areas that we're exploring at RAND as possible solution spaces. But we really are focused on, again, on this kind of holistic approach to the problem. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm just really happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Jennifer.